The snow was falling soft and quiet, like a promise the world was ready to forget them. It clung to the churchyard fence, draped over the crooked wooden markers of 3 small graves. Martha Whitlock held her husband's hand, his knuckles white against hers. His grip was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to whispers and cold air. The whispers came from the townsfolk huddled near the church doors. They didn't look at her, not directly, but she felt their eyes all the same. Sharp little points of judgment. They said her house was cursed. They said her grief was a sickness. They said God had turned his face from the Whitlocks. Sheriff Amos Boone stepped forward, his breath a cloud in the freezing air. His badge was a dull star on his thick wool coat. "Martha, Thomas, you gotta understand. Folks are scared." Thomas lifted his head. His eyes were red, but they were steady. He'd done all his crying. "Scared of what, Amos? A grieving man? An old woman with nothing left?" That's when Beatrice Harlan's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and cruel as a shard of ice. "It ain't natural, losing all 3 at once. It's a judgment, plain as day." Martha flinched. Beatrice, the same woman who'd shared coffee in her kitchen just a year ago, the same woman who'd held her hand at the first burial, and then the second, and then the third. Now, that woman wouldn't even meet her gaze. The sheriff cleared his throat, a heavy, final sound. "By the council's word," he said, his voice flat, "you're to be out of town by sundown. Take what you can carry." He wasn't just delivering a message. He was drawing a line in the snow. On one side was the town, warm and safe. On the other side were Martha and Thomas, alone. Thomas didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just gave one slow, tired nod and turned away from the graves of his children. He turned away from the town he'd helped build. And Martha followed him, her hand tight in his, walking back to a home that was no longer theirs. They packed in silence. The cabin was cold, the hearth long dead. Little things were everywhere. A carved horse by the fireplace, a blue ribbon on a chair, the ghosts of their children's laughter. Martha folded the ribbon and put it in her satchel. It felt heavier than stone. Thomas gathered what little food they had. Hard bread, salted pork, 2 wrinkled apples. His hands moved slow, mechanical. This was the man who had once been strong enough to break a wild horse, now brought low by a town's fear. As the sun began to dip below the trees, painting the snow in shades of blood and orange, they stepped outside one last time. The whole town was watching, faces in every window, pale and silent. As they passed the general store, Beatrice Harlan stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her face was a mask of cold satisfaction. She had gotten what she wanted. The road stretched out before them, a white ribbon disappearing into the dark woods. The snow was already covering their tracks. It was like they were never there at all. Martha leaned against Thomas, the cold seeping into her bones. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "When the world shuts its doors, you carry your own fire." But her fire was almost out, a tiny flickering ember in a world of ice. That first night, they built a small, pathetic fire that sputtered against the wind. The darkness of the woods pressed in on all sides, alive with sounds she couldn't name. Thomas gave her the last apple. His own stomach was hollow with hunger, but he offered it to her. She broke it in half and pushed a piece back into his hand. Their eyes met over the dancing flames. No words were needed. This was all they had left, each other. The days that followed were a blur of white snow and gray skies. Thomas's cough got worse, a deep rattling sound that scared her more than the howling of wolves in the night. She tore strips from her own shawl to wrap his hands, even as her own fingers grew numb and useless. On the 3rd morning, he fell, just collapsed into a drift of snow, his body giving up. "Thomas!" she cried, scrambling to his side. His face was ashen, his lips blue, his eyes fluttered open. Maybe it's for the best, Martha," he whispered. his breath a faint mist. Something inside her broke, a dam of grief and fear and rage she hadn't even known was there. "No," she said, her voice raw. She pressed her forehead against his, her tears freezing on his skin. "You can't leave me. Not you. You can't leave me to walk this road alone." He looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man he used to be. The stubborn, strong man who had never backed down from a fight in his life. Slowly, with her help, he got to his feet. They pressed on, one step, then another. Each one a tiny victory against the vast, empty wilderness. But the wilderness wasn't done with them yet. That night, the wind was a living thing, tearing at their clothes, stealing what little warmth their fire offered. The last of their wood was gone. Martha huddled close to Thomas, listening to the shallow rasp of his breathing. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with a quiet freezing in the dark. She closed her eyes, almost ready for it. And that's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. The crunch of a heavy boot on frozen snow. Her eyes snapped open. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight. A man. Taller than anyone she had ever seen, wrapped in thick furs, his beard a wild tangle of frost. He looked like he was born from the mountain itself. Thomas fumbled for the small hatchet in their bundle, but the man just raised a hand, palm open. A gesture of peace. His eyes were dark, unreadable in the flickering light. He studied them for a long moment, and Martha felt his gaze like a physical weight. It wasn't the cruel judgment of the town. This was something older. Colder. The wind howled through the trees. The fire sputtered. Then the stranger spoke, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You don't belong in the cold." He took a step closer, his massive form blocking out the night. "Come with me." Thomas's hand, the one holding the hatchet, slowly lowered. He looked from the giant stranger to his wife, huddled and shivering, and he knew they had no choice. "We've nowhere else to go," Thomas rasped, his voice thin as a whisper. The man just nodded once, as if this was the only answer that mattered. He turned and started walking back into the trees, his broad back a shield against the storm. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He didn't need to. Martha and Thomas pushed themselves up, their frozen limbs screaming in protest. They followed the stranger through snowdrifts so deep they felt like they were drowning. The forest was a maze of black trunks and howling wind. Just when Martha thought she couldn't take another step, the trees opened up. There, tucked into a hollow of the mountain, was a small cabin. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney, a fragile gray ribbon against the dark sky. It looked like the sturdiest, most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The man pushed the door open, and a wave of warmth and light washed over them. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat filled the air. Martha felt tears well in her eyes. It was the smell of life. The inside was simple. Just one room. Furs covered the floor, and a set of antlers hung over a large stone hearth where a fire roared. It was a man's space, rough and functional. Without a word, their rescuer ladled thick, hot broth into 2 wooden bowls and handed them to them. Martha's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the spoon. The hot liquid burned her tongue, but it was the most wonderful pain she had ever felt. It was the feeling of coming back from the dead. Thomas ate slowly, his eyes never leaving the big man who sat on a stool by the fire, his face half hidden in shadow. Finally, Thomas found his voice. "You saved our lives, stranger. We don't even know your name." The man looked up. The firelight caught the hard lines of his face, the old scars that crisscrossed his skin. "Name's Jedediah," he rumbled. "Jedediah Boone." He said the name like it was a fact, like a mountain or a river, unchanging. But then he added something else, his voice dropping so low Martha had to strain to hear it. "And I know who you are, Thomas Whitlock. I've been waiting for you." The words hung in the warm air of the cabin, colder than the wind outside. Waiting for them? What could this wild mountain man possibly want with two broken-down old folks who'd been cast out by their own people? Martha looked at her husband and saw the same fear and confusion mirrored in his eyes. They hadn't just been rescued. They had walked into something else entirely, something far more dangerous than a winter storm. The days that followed were filled with a strange, heavy silence. Jedediah Boone was not a man for small talk. He moved with a purpose that felt ancient and powerful. He would rise before the sun, the sound of his axe splitting firewood echoing through the hollow like a drumbeat. Thomas, desperate to prove he wasn't just a burden, would follow him out. The first time Thomas tried to lift the heavy axe, he nearly fell over. His body was frail, wasted by grief and starvation. Jedediah didn't laugh. He didn't say a word. He just walked over, put his own massive scarred hands over Thomas's, and guided the swing. The axe came down with a clean, sharp crack, splitting the log perfectly. In that small moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of his old self. While the men worked, Martha stayed inside. She found Jedediah's sewing kit, a rough collection of needles and sinew thread, and mended the tears in his fur coat. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, but her stitches were small and even. When Jedediah came in that evening, she held the coat out to him. He took it, ran a thumb over her careful work, and gave her a short, sharp nod. It was the closest he came to a thank you. Later that night, as she dozed by the fire, he quietly draped an extra bearskin over her shoulders. They were small things, these unspoken kindnesses, but they began to weave a fragile trust between the three of them. Still, Martha couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Jedediah was a man haunted by shadows. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear him pacing outside the cabin, the crunch of his boots a restless rhythm in the snow. Once, she peeked through a crack in the door and saw him standing at the edge of the trees, his long rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was staring out into the darkness, not at the town below, but into the deep, wild parts of the forest. He was watching, waiting, hunting. But for what? His silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a man who carried a great weight, a great sorrow. Martha saw it in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. It was the same hollowed-out look she saw in the mirror every morning. She wondered what ghosts lived with him in this lonely cabin. What family had he lost? What had driven him so high into these unforgiving mountains, so far from other people? Jedediah never spoke of his past, and they never asked. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how high you climb. Word of their survival started to trickle back down the mountain. A hunter, chasing a buck too far into the high country, saw the smoke from Jedediah's chimney. He saw the old woman, Martha, hanging laundry on a line between two pines. He went back to town with a story that spread like wildfire. The Whitlocks weren't dead. The curse hadn't taken them. They were alive. They were living with the beast of the mountain, Jedediah Boone. Beatrice Harland was the first to start the new whispers. "It's an affront to God!" she shrieked in the general store. "They were judged, cast out, and now they live up there, warm and fed, while good honest folk suffer through this winter. That Boone, he's no better than them. A savage." The fear in town began to curdle into anger, an ugly, righteous anger. They hadn't just cast the Whitlocks out to die. They had expected them to. Their survival felt like a mockery, like they'd gotten away with something. Trouble was coming. Martha could feel it in the air, in the way the wind seemed to carry the town's hatred up the mountainside. It came one gray morning, with the crunch of many boots in the snow. It wasn't Jedediah's heavy, solitary tread. This was a crowd. The cabin door swung open without a knock. Sheriff Amos stood there, his face grim. Behind him were 3 other men from the town, their rifles held loosely, but ready. Jedediah rose from his place by the fire. He didn't pick up his own rifle, which was leaning against the wall. He didn't need to. His size, his very presence, was a weapon. The small cabin seemed to shrink around him. "State your purpose, Amos." Jedediah's voice was a low rumble. The sheriff's eyes flicked past him, to where Martha and Thomas sat at the small table. "Town's uneasy, Jedediah. They say you're harboring these 2. They say you're poaching deer from town lands." "What I hunt on my mountain is my business," Jedediah said. "And who I welcome at my fire is my business too." And that's when Beatrice Harlan pushed her way past the sheriff. Her face was red and pinched with cold and fury. "Your fire!" she spat, her eyes locking onto Martha. "You were meant to vanish. We watched you walk away. But here you are, eating meat while our children have thin soup. If that ain't proof of wickedness, I don't know what is." Her words were like stones, hitting Martha one by one. She felt Thomas tremble beside her, and she reached for his arm. Jedediah took a step forward, and the men behind the sheriff flinched. "This is my home," he growled. "You'll not dictate terms beneath my roof." Amos's hand drifted towards the pistol at his belt. The air in the cabin was thick, electric. One wrong move, one wrong word, and blood would be spilled on the floorboards. But then, something shifted. It wasn't Jedediah who moved. It was Thomas. Frail, pale Thomas Whitlock. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his body trembling with a weakness that had nothing to do with fear. He walked slowly, unsteadily, until he was standing right in front of the sheriff. He looked past Amos, past Beatrice, to the men behind them. Men he had known his whole life. "You think we're cursed," he said, his voice raspy but clear. It carried through the silent cabin. "You think burying our children wasn't sorrow enough." He took a shaky breath. "But listen to me. Grief is not wickedness. Hunger is not a sin. We lost everything, and yet somehow we still breathe. Does that offend you so much?" The room was dead silent. Even Beatrice looked stunned. No one had expected the broken old man to speak, let alone with such fire. "We never asked for your pity," Thomas went on, his voice growing stronger. "We only wanted to be left alone with our memories. You couldn't even give us that. You drove us out to die because our sorrow made you uncomfortable." Martha stood up then and walked to her husband's side, slipping her hand into his. She looked directly at Beatrice, her eyes clear and filled with a pain so deep it was beyond tears. "If our survival offends you," Martha said, her voice steady, "then so be it. But we will not apologize for it. We will not apologize for still holding each other's hands." Sheriff Amos looked from the old couple's defiant faces to the towering, silent mountain man behind them. He saw the hard set of Jedediah's jaw. He knew this wasn't a fight he could win. Not today. "Let's go," he muttered to the men. "There's nothing for us here." He turned and left, the others shuffling out behind him. Beatrice lingered for a moment, her face a storm of hatred and confusion. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words died on her lips. For the first time, she looked away from Martha's gaze, ashamed. Then she, too, was gone. The door swung shut, plunging the cabin back into quiet. Thomas sagged, the sudden burst of strength leaving him completely. Jedediah's big hand landed on his shoulder, steadying him. "You got more fire in you than you know, old man," Jedediah murmured. The words were gruff, but there was a deep respect in his voice. That night, as the storm raged outside, the little cabin felt warmer than ever. It felt like a fortress. But as Martha watched the flames dance in the hearth, a new, chilling thought took root in her mind. Thomas was right. They weren't cursed. The town wasn't afraid of a curse. They were afraid of something else, afraid of the Whitlocks themselves. But why? What secret were they hiding? What did the town really believe happened to her children? And then she looked over at Jedediah, who was cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. His face was a mask of concentration. He had been waiting for them. He had known their names. This wasn't over. The confrontation with the town wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. After the sheriff and his posse left, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the comfortable silence of before. It was heavy, filled with unasked questions. Martha watched Jedediah stoke the fire, his movements precise and controlled. He was a man who wasted nothing. Not a piece of wood, not a word. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "You knew my husband's name," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You said you were waiting for us. Why?" Jedediah stopped, the poker resting in the flames. He didn't turn around for a long moment. When he finally did, the firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making the old scars look like fresh wounds. "Because what happened to you," he said, his voice a low growl, "happened to me first." The air left Martha's lungs. She looked at Thomas, who was staring at Jedediah, his face pale. "I had a wife once," Jedediah continued, his gaze fixed on something far away, something only he could see. "A daughter. Her name was Clara. She had hair the color of corn silk." He paused, swallowing hard. "We lived down in that town, tried to make a life there, but the winters are hard. Sickness comes." Martha felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "A fever?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Jedediah nodded slowly. "That's what the Reverend called it. A swift, sudden fever. Took her in 2 days. 1 week later, my wife Eleanor followed her." He turned to face them fully, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, so familiar, it was like looking into a mirror of her own soul. "The town whispered," he said, his voice thick with a bitterness that time had not dulled. "They said I was cursed, that I'd brought something foul out of the mountains with me. They held a council, and they cast me out, just like they did you." So that was it. The ghost that haunted him, the reason he lived alone on this mountain. He wasn't just a hermit. He was an exile. "But I never believed it was a fever," Jedediah said, his voice dropping, becoming hard as flint. "Clara. She was strong, healthy, and just before she got sick, she complained that the water from the well tasted bitter. Bitter water." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of her grief. Her son, Jonah, the day he took ill. He'd come inside from playing, taken a long drink from the water pail, and made a face. "This water tastes funny, Mama," he'd said. "It's all bitter." She had dismissed it. She'd told him he was imagining things. The next morning the fever had begun. She looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. He was staring back at her, his face ashen. He remembered it too. "Our children," Martha stammered, her hand flying to her mouth. "They said the same thing. Ruth, Samuel. They all said the water tasted wrong that day. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't a fever. It was poison. Someone in that town, that good, God-fearing town, had walked to their well, under the cover of night, and poisoned their children." The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that Martha felt the room begin to spin. Who? Who could do such a thing? And why? "Beatrice," Thomas breathed, the name like a curse on his lips. "She always envied our land, the way it borders the river." Jedediah shook his head. "Beatrice is cruel, but she's not a killer of children. This is something else, something colder, more patient." He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. "When they drove me out, I swore I wouldn't just vanish. I've been watching them, for years, I've seen the patterns." "Patterns?" Thomas asked. "Every few years," Jedediah said, his eyes dark. "A family on the edge of town. A family that keeps to itself. A sudden fever takes a child. Or two. The family is pitied, then feared, then shunned. Most of them just pack up and leave, broken." He stopped pacing and looked at them. "You were different. You lost all three. And you refused to leave. You stayed. You forced their hand. They had to cast you out." A horrifying tapestry began to form in Martha's mind. A hidden sickness that plagued the town for years, covered up by superstition and fear. It wasn't God's judgment, it was a man's. "We need proof," Thomas said, his voice shaking with a new kind of strength. Not defiance, but a cold, hard rage. "We need to go back." "The town will be watching for you," Jedediah warned. "The sheriff will have men on the roads." "Not the roads," Thomas said, his eyes locking with Jedediah's. "We won't go through the town. We'll go over it." He was looking at the mountain that loomed behind the cabin, the sheer cliffs, the impassable ridges. Jedediah gave a slow, grim smile. "The trails I use, they aren't on any map. It will be dangerous. A storm is coming in tonight. It will cover our tracks, but it could also be our tomb." "We buried 3 children," Martha said, her voice low and steady. "We are not afraid of tombs." The plan was simple and insane. Under the cover of the coming blizzard, Jedediah and Thomas would use the high mountain trails to circle around the town and come down from the north to their old, abandoned cabin. Martha would stay behind, keeping the fire burning, a beacon for their return. "What are you looking for?" she asked Thomas as he bundled himself in extra furs. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something, anything, something they might have missed, a footprint, a dropped button, some sign of who was near our well that night." As darkness fell, the storm hit with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow blew so thick it was like a solid white wall. Martha stood in the doorway of Jedediah's cabin, watching as the 2 men disappeared into the swirling chaos. Thomas, frail and old, and Jedediah, a ghost of the mountain, moving through the storm as if he were part of it. The door closed, and she was alone with the howling wind and the roaring fire. Hours passed. Each minute felt like an eternity. She imagined them slipping on an icy ledge, buried in an avalanche, lost in the whiteout. Her heart was a cold, tight knot in her chest. She sat by the fire, her hands clutching the small, faded blue ribbon she had saved. The last piece of her daughter. She prayed. Not to the town's God, the God of judgment and fear, but to something older, something in the heart of the mountain itself. "Keep them safe," she prayed. "Bring them home." Meanwhile, Thomas and Jedediah fought their way through the blizzard. The wind was a physical force, trying to rip them from the narrow, icy path. Thomas's lungs burned with every breath. He could feel the cold seeping deep into his bones, a familiar, deadly chill. But this time was different. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was hunting. The thought of his children, of their last trusting faces, fueled a fire in him that no storm could extinguish. Jedediah moved ahead of him, a silent, sure-footed guide. He seemed to know every rock, every twisted tree. He was a part of this wild place, and for the first time, Thomas was grateful for it. After what felt like a lifetime, the trees began to thin. Through the swirling snow, Thomas could see the faint, scattered lights of the town below. They had made it. They scrambled down the last steep slope and found themselves in the woods behind their old property. The cabin stood dark and silent, half buried in snow. It looked like a tombstone. They crept towards the back of the house, staying deep in the shadows. The well was a dark circle covered by a simple wooden lid. Jedediah knelt, running his gloved hands over the ground around the well. But the new snow had covered everything. Any tracks, any sign, was long gone, buried under a fresh blanket of white. Nothing, Jedediah grunted in frustration. Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him. Had they risked everything for nothing? He leaned against the cold wall of the cabin, his heart heavy. His eyes scanned the familiar lines of his home. His home. He had built this place with his own 2 hands. He knew every board, every nail. And that's when he saw it. Something was wrong. A single floorboard on the small back porch. It was slightly raised. Not enough for a stranger to notice. But he noticed. He had laid that board himself, fitted it snug against its neighbor. Now there was a gap. A shadow. Someone had been here. Someone had pried it loose. He pointed, his hand shaking. Jedediah! Look! Jedediah saw it instantly. He pulled a long hunting knife from his belt and carefully worked the tip into the crack. He pried. The board groaned in protest and then came loose. They both peered into the dark space beneath. It wasn't a footprint. It wasn't a dropped button. It was a small bundle, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Jedediah reached in and pulled it out. It was heavy for its size. With numb fingers, he untied the twine and unfolded the cloth. Inside wasn't a bag of poison or some dark, sinister tool. It was a book. A small, leather-bound journal. The leather was old and cracked with age. Thomas took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't his. It wasn't Martha's. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, faded script. The ink was brown with age. The first entry was dated 50 years ago. It was a woman's diary. And the first sentence made the blood freeze in Thomas's veins. Another child taken by the winter fever, it read. Little Abigail. She complained of bitter water from the well the day before. The Reverend Pike says it is God's will, a test of our faith. But I am not so sure. This is the 3rd child this winter. The 3rd family to pack their wagon and leave in sorrow. Reverend Pike. Not their current Reverend, Josiah Pike. This entry was 50 years old. It had to be his father. Or his grandfather. Thomas's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. It was all there. A meticulous secret record of death. Year after year. A child gets sick. The family is shunned. The family leaves. The pattern Jedediah had seen. It had been happening for generations. A quiet, systematic cleansing of the town. But who was this woman who kept the diary? And why hide it under his floorboard? He turned to the last page. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. He knows I am watching, the entry read. The Reverend came to my house today. He brought me a special tea for my cough. He smiled his holy smile, but his eyes were cold as a winter grave. I know what is in the tea. I will not drink it. I have hidden this book. If something should happen to me, may God grant that some honest soul finds it. The truth must be known. The wolf wears the shepherd's clothes. The entry was unsigned. Who lived here before us? Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. An old woman, Jedediah said. A midwife, Elspeth. She died just before you bought the land. The town said it was old age, that she passed peacefully in her sleep. Elspeth, the midwife, a woman who would have known every birth and every death in the town. A woman who would have seen the pattern. A woman who asked too many questions. And the Pikes. A whole family of reverends, passing down their pulpit and their poison, from father to son. This wasn't about land or greed. This was something far more twisted. A holy crusade. A cleansing of the town, getting rid of any family they deemed unworthy, using superstition as their weapon. Suddenly, a dog barked from the edge of town. Then another. Lights flickered on in the nearest houses. A shout cut through the storm.
Who's out there? They had been discovered. Jedediah grabbed the book, shoving it inside his coat. We have to go. Now.
They scrambled back up the slope, their lungs screaming, the sounds of a pursuit rising behind them. Men were shouting, doors were slamming. They plunged back into the blizzard, the white fury of the mountain their only ally. They ran blind and desperate, with the truth held tight against Jedediah's chest. A truth so dark and terrible, it could either save them or get them all killed. Because they didn't just know what had happened to their children. They knew who was next. They ran. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, swallowed by the storm. The mountain was a treacherous beast in the dark, but Jedediah moved with an instinct that defied the senses. He was a creature of this place, and he led Thomas through the blizzard's teeth, back up the hidden paths, toward the tiny spark of hope that was his cabin. They burst through the door, half frozen and gasping for air, bringing a whirlwind of snow in with them. Martha rushed to them, her face etched with worry. "What happened? We heard shouting." "They saw us," Thomas panted, collapsing onto a stool by the fire. He was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the terrible knowledge they now carried. Jedediah pulled the old leather journal from his coat and placed it on the table. "We found this." Martha stared at the book, then at her husband's face. "What is it?" "It's proof," Thomas said, his voice raw. "Proof that it wasn't a curse. It was him. It's always been him." He explained everything: the midwife's diary, the generations of Pikes, the bitter water, the quiet, systematic murder of children, cloaked in the language of God's will. Martha sank into a chair, her hand covering her mouth. The sheer calculated evil of it was staggering. Reverend Josiah Pike, the man who had laid a comforting hand on her shoulder at the funeral, the man who had offered his prayers while knowing he was the very monster who had destroyed her family. The fire in her heart, the one she thought was a dying ember, roared to life. It was no longer the soft glow of love or the dim warmth of survival. It was a white-hot, cleansing fire of pure rage. She looked at Jedediah. "Your wife, your daughter, it was his father." Jedediah nodded, his jaw tight. A poison passed down like a family Bible. For years he had lived with the town's judgment, believing he was cursed. For years he had been haunted by a ghost he couldn't name. Now the ghost had a face, the face of a holy man. "What do we do?" Martha asked. Her voice was no longer that of a victim. It was the voice of a woman with a war to win. "We can't just go to the sheriff," Jedediah said. "Amos is a weak man. He follows the council, and the Reverend holds the council in the palm of his hand. He'll call us liars. He'll say we're possessed. He'll turn the whole town against us." "He already has," Thomas said bitterly. "We need more than the book," Jedediah continued, his mind working, his eyes sharp. "The book tells us what happened in the past. We need to prove what's happening now. We need the poison itself." Martha's mind raced. Poison. Where would he get it? Where would he hide it? Not in his home. Too risky. Not at the church. Too public. It had to be somewhere private, somewhere sacred to him. And then she remembered something. A small detail from years ago. Something she hadn't thought about until this very moment. The Reverend had a garden. Not behind the church, but a small, walled-off plot of land deep in the woods, on the far side of the river. He called it his meditation garden. He said it was where he went to be alone with God. She had seen him there once while gathering berries. He had been tending the plants, his back to her. He hadn't seen her. But she had seen the flowers. They weren't roses or lilies. They were strange, purple, bell-shaped flowers on a tall stalk. She'd thought them beautiful, but odd. "His garden," she said aloud. "He has a private garden in the woods." Jedediah looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "What grows there?" "I don't know the name," she said. "But the flowers are purple, and shaped like a monk's hood." A look of grim recognition crossed Jedediah's face. "Wolfsbane," he whispered. Also known as aconite, an old poison, odorless, a few drops in a well, and the water turns bitter just before it stops your heart. That was it. The final piece, the motive, the method, the monster. But knowing the truth and proving it were two very different things. The garden was miles away, on the other side of town. The storm was still raging, and now, the town would be on high alert. They were trapped on the mountain, armed with a truth no one would believe. Just then, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a deep, mournful sound that echoed up the mountain. The church bell. It wasn't the gentle call to Sunday service. It was ringing fast and frantic. It was an alarm. Jedediah went to the small window, wiping the frost away with his sleeve. He peered down at the flickering lights of the town below. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "They've gathered at the church," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "I can see torches, a lot of them." Martha's blood ran cold. The Reverend wasn't going to wait for the sheriff to hunt them down. He was using their discovery at the cabin to whip the town into a frenzy. He was turning their fear into a weapon. He was painting them as devils, as blasphemers who had desecrated a home. He was organizing a mob, a lynch mob. "They're coming for us," she said. Jedediah turned from the window, and for the first time, Martha saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not just sorrow or anger. It was the cold, hard look of a man about to go to war. He walked over to the wall and took down his long rifle. He checked the action, his movements swift and sure. Then he took down 2 more rifles from a rack she hadn't noticed before. He handed one to Thomas. Thomas looked at the weapon. It had been years since he'd held a rifle. His hands were old and stiff. But as his fingers wrapped around the cold wood and steel, something straightened in his back. The grief-stricken farmer was gone. In his place was a man with nothing left to lose and a debt of blood to collect. "They'll have to come through the narrow pass just below the ridge," Jedediah said, his voice calm and deadly. "It's the only way up. The storm is on our side. They won't see us until it's too late." Martha looked from her husband to the mountain man. They were going to fight. They were going to make their stand here, in this tiny cabin against a whole town. It was suicide. A noble, brave, and utterly hopeless last stand. But what choice did they have? To run again? To let the Reverend win? To let the memory of their children be buried under a lie? No. She walked over to the hearth and picked up the heavy iron poker. It was clumsy, but it was solid. It was something to hold on to. The 3 of them stood there, in the warm glow of the fire, listening to the shrieking wind and the distant, angry tolling of the bell. An old woman, a broken farmer, and a haunted mountain man. They were outcasts. They were the judged. They were the cursed. And they were the only things standing between a town full of lies and a terrible holy truth. The torchlight was a serpent of fire, winding its way up the mountain. From the cabin window, they could see it moving slowly through the blizzard, a horde of angry shadows against the snow. Martha could hear them now, a faint baying sound carried on the wind. The voices of her neighbors, twisted by fear and the Reverend's poison words. "There must be 30 of them," Jedediah said, his voice flat. He was checking the powder in his rifle. "More than I expected." Thomas stood beside him, his own rifle held tight. His knuckles were white. "They're not just coming to talk." No, they were coming to burn them out, to erase the curse from the mountainside with fire and violence. This was the final solution, the town cleansing itself. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. They had the truth. The diary was sitting right there on the table. But it was useless if they were all dead. They couldn't win a direct fight. 3 against 30? It was a massacre waiting to happen. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice urgent. "They expect us to be trapped here, a cornered animal. But we're not animals." Thomas looked at her. "There's nowhere to run, Martha. Not run, she said, her eyes meeting Jedediah's. We don't run. We hunt. A flicker of understanding passed between them. The mob was predictable. They were following the path, the one way up to the cabin. But Jedediah, he didn't need paths. The garden, Martha said, the plan forming in her mind, desperate and brilliant. They're all up here following you. That leaves the town empty. The garden will be unguarded. Jedediah's eyes lit up with a dangerous fire. It's a long way around, through the worst of the storm, and they'll realize we're gone eventually. But not before we get what we need, Thomas said, catching on. We bring the poison back, not to the sheriff, to the people. We show them the truth on Sunday morning. It was an insane gamble, to leave the safety of their fortress, to plunge back into the storm, to race a bloodthirsty mob to the truth. But it was their only chance. Give me the book, Martha said to Thomas. She tucked the old diary deep inside her coat, protecting it with her own body. This was her evidence, her children's last testament. Jedediah was already moving. He kicked open a small trapdoor in the floor that Martha had never noticed. Below was a dark, narrow space. A tunnel. It leads out to the rocks behind the cabin, he explained. I dug it for winters like this, or for days like this. He looked at them, his face grim. Once we're out, there's no turning back. If they catch us in the open... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas took Martha's hand. Together, he said. Together, she replied. They descended into the cold, damp earth. Jedediah went first, then Martha, then Thomas, who pulled the trapdoor shut behind them, plunging them into absolute darkness. They crawled through the tight, suffocating tunnel. The sounds of the storm and the mob faded away, replaced by the sound of their own frantic breathing and the scraping of their bodies against the frozen dirt. It felt like being buried alive. After what seemed an eternity, Jedediah pushed open a heavy stone at the other end. They emerged into the full fury of the blizzard, 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden by a cluster of massive boulders. From their hiding place, they could see the mob arriving at the cabin. They surrounded it, torches held high, their faces illuminated in the hellish light. They were screaming, their voices full of hate. Come out, Boone! Come out, you devil worshippers! It was Beatrice's voice, shrill and full of venom. Then, a figure stepped forward from the crowd, tall and imposing, even in the storm. Reverend Josiah Pike. He held up a hand, and the crowd fell silent. The Lord's work must be done, he cried, his voice booming over the wind. This mountain must be cleansed of this unholy curse. Burn it all to ash. Several men ran forward with their torches and thrust them into the dry timbers of the cabin walls. The wood caught instantly. Flames erupted, licking up the side of the cabin, turning the snow around it a sickening orange. Martha watched in horror as the cabin, their only sanctuary, was consumed by fire. The mob cheered. They thought they were burning them alive. Jedediah put a hand on her shoulder. Don't watch, he whispered. We have to move. Now. He led them away from the terrible scene, deeper into the wilderness, using the roaring fire and the mob's distraction as cover. They were ghosts, slipping away into the storm, leaving their own funeral behind. The journey was a nightmare. They battled their way through waist-deep snow, around treacherous ice-covered cliffs. The wind tore at them, trying to suck the very breath from their lungs. Martha's body screamed in protest, but her mind was a sharp, cold point of focus. The image of the Reverend's face, lit by the flames of the burning cabin, was burned into her memory. The face of a monster, hiding behind a mask of righteousness. She clutched the diary inside her coat. It was all for her children. For Ruth, Jonah, and Samuel. For Jedediah's Clara and Eleanor. For all the other forgotten children whose names were written in this secret book. Their ghosts were marching with her through the storm. and they were crying out for justice. After hours that felt like years, they finally descended from the high country into the woods on the other side of town. The storm was beginning to lessen, the wind easing its howl. Through the trees, Martha could see the river, and on the far bank, a high stone wall, the Reverend's garden. They found a shallow place to cross the icy river, the water so cold it felt like fire. They scrambled up the opposite bank, soaked and shivering, and crept towards the wall. A single wooden door was set into the stone, locked with a heavy iron bolt. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He put his shoulder to it and heaved. The old wood groaned. He heaved again, and with a crack of splintering wood, the lock gave way. They slipped inside. The garden was an eerie, silent place. The snow covered everything in a pristine blanket of white, but even in the monochrome landscape, she could see them. Rows and rows of tall, dead stalks, their distinctive seed pods rattling in the breeze. Wolfsbane. Enough poison to kill every child in the town 10 times over. "We have it," Thomas breathed, a note of triumph in his voice. "We have the proof." But as Jedediah reached down to pull one of the plants from the frozen earth, a sound made them all freeze. A soft click from the shadows near the garden wall. The sound of a rifle hammer being cocked. "I must admit," a calm, familiar voice said from the darkness, "I didn't think you'd be this clever." A figure stepped out from behind a snow-covered statue of an angel. It wasn't the Reverend. It was Sheriff Amos Boone, and his rifle was pointed directly at Thomas's heart. "I'm afraid your journey ends here," the sheriff said, his voice laced with a cold, matter-of-fact regret. Sheriff Amos Boone stood there, his rifle steady, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. The angel statue behind him seemed to weep icy tears. "Amos," Thomas said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What is this? You know what he is. You know what he's done." "I know my duty," the sheriff said, his eyes hard. "And my duty is to maintain order. The Reverend. He provides order." Martha's mind reeled. The sheriff wasn't weak. He was complicit. He had known. All this time he had known about the poison, about the children. He was the Reverend's enforcer, the one who cleaned up the loose ends. "The midwife Elspeth," Jedediah growled, taking a slow step to the side, drawing the sheriff's attention. "That was you, wasn't it? You made it look peaceful." The sheriff gave a slight nod. "She wouldn't listen to reason. She threatened the stability of this town. Just like you are now." The stability. That's what it was all about. A town kept pure, kept in line through fear and secret murder. A town run by a fanatic and protected by a man with a badge and no soul. "You let him kill our children," Martha said, the words dripping with venom. "You stood by and let it happen." "It was a regrettable necessity," Amos said, his voice still chillingly calm. "Your family was becoming a problem. Too many mouths, not enough faith." The Reverend made his decision. I carried out the council's will. So the council knew too. The town's leaders. It wasn't just the Reverend. It was a conspiracy. A rot that went to the very core of the town. "There is no council," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "There is only Pike, and you are his dog." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Your cabin is ash. The town thinks you're dead. All I have to do is pull this trigger, and the story is over. 3 desperate fugitives, shot while resisting arrest. A tragic, but necessary end. He was going to kill them. Right here, in this garden of death, and bury them with the secret. But he had made a mistake. He had focused on Jedediah, the biggest threat. He had underestimated the old man." While he was talking, Thomas had been slowly, imperceptibly, taking handfuls of loose snow and dirt from the ground. Now, with a sudden, desperate roar, he flung it directly at the sheriff's face. Amos cried out, momentarily blinded, his rifle wavering. It was the only chance they would get. Jedediah lunged, not at the sheriff, but at the rifle, grabbing the barrel and wrenching it upwards. The gun went off with a deafening blast, the shot tearing harmlessly through the tree branches above. Thomas, fueled by a rage he didn't know he possessed, charged forward and tackled the sheriff at the knees. They both went down in the snow, a tangle of limbs. Amos was bigger, stronger. He threw Thomas off and scrambled for the rifle. But Martha was there first. She grabbed the heavy iron bolt from the broken garden door and swung it with all her might. It connected with the side of the sheriff's head with a sickening crack. He grunted. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed unconscious in the snow. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing in the silent garden. They had won, but the fight was far from over. "He won't be out for long," Jedediah said, already tearing strips from the sheriff's coat to bind his hands and feet. "We have to move." Thomas grabbed the sheriff's rifle and a handful of the wolfsbane plants, roots and all, the evidence. "Where do we go?" he asked. "The town will be waking up soon. They'll find him." "There's only one place to go," Martha said, her voice resolute. "The one place he can't hide from the truth. The one place where everyone will be." She looked towards the town. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. A bell began to toll, a slow, steady, peaceful toll. The call to Sunday service. "We're going to church," she said. The doors of the church were thick oak, meant to keep the evils of the world out. But today, evil was already inside, standing at the pulpit. They didn't try to sneak in. They walked right up the main street, in the full light of the rising sun. Thomas in front, holding the sheriff's rifle. Martha at his side, clutching the wolfsbane. Jedediah followed behind, a silent, grim guardian. People stopped and stared. Gasps of shock and fear rippled through the small crowds making their way to the service. The Whitlocks and Boone. They were supposed to be dead. They looked like ghosts, ghosts who had come back for vengeance. They didn't stop. They walked up the stone steps of the church and pushed the heavy doors open. The entire town was packed inside. The pews were full, and standing at the front, in his black robes, was Reverend Josiah Pike. He was in the middle of a sermon. He was telling the hushed congregation about the terrible, righteous fire that had cleansed the mountain. He was calling it a victory for the faithful, a sign of God's favor. Then he saw them. His voice faltered. His face, which had been a mask of holy benevolence, went slack with shock. For a split second, Martha saw the monster behind the mask. She saw pure, undiluted fear in his eyes. The congregation turned, following his gaze. A collective gasp swept through the church. Thomas walked down the central aisle, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He didn't raise the rifle, he just held it. He walked all the way to the front and stopped at the foot of the pulpit. He looked up at the Reverend. "You're standing in God's house, Reverend," Thomas said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent church. "But you are not a man of God." Pike quickly regained his composure. He drew himself up, his face becoming a mask of righteous indignation. "Thomas Whitlock, you are supposed to be dead. This is sacrilege. You dare to bring weapons into this holy place?" "The only weapon in this church," Martha said, stepping forward beside her husband, "is the one you've been using for years." She held up the wolfsbane plant, its roots dangling, its purple flowers looking sinister in the stained glass light. "Do you recognize this, Reverend?" she asked. "From your special garden, the place you go to be alone with your God?" The Reverend's face went pale. He looked from the plant to the diary that Jedediah was now holding up for all to see. "Lies," Pike thundered, his voice booming. "These are the devil's tricks. This man, this mountain beast, has twisted their minds with his dark magic. They burned their own home, and now they come to desecrate ours." Some of the people in the pews murmured, nodding. They wanted to believe him. It was easier to believe in a curse than to believe their holy man was a murderer. "He's lying!" Beatrice Harland screamed from her pew. "They're monsters! The sheriff should arrest them!" "The sheriff won't be coming," Jedediah said, his voice like a rock slide. "He's tied up in your reverend's garden of poison." The crowd stirred, confused, scared. Pike saw he was losing them. He pointed a trembling finger at Martha. "Tell them, Beatrice. Tell them how this woman is cursed. Tell them what really happened to her children." Martha's blood ran cold. What did he mean? Beatrice stood up, her face a strange mix of fear and triumph. "I'll tell them," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll tell them what I saw." She turned to the congregation. "Years ago, my own son took sick with the fever. He was near death. The reverend here, he prayed for him. He brought him a special herbal tea, and my boy was saved. A miracle!" She then pointed at Martha. "But when her children took sick, she turned the reverend away. She wouldn't let him pray for them. She wouldn't accept his tea. Her pride killed her children. Her lack of faith is the curse." The story was perfect, plausible. It painted Martha as the villain, the reverend as the spurned savior. The crowd began to turn, their faces hardening into the familiar masks of judgment. But Martha just looked at Beatrice, a deep, soul-crushing pity in her eyes. "He brought you a tea, Beatrice?" Martha asked, her voice soft. "Did your son happen to mention if it tasted bitter?" The color drained from Beatrice's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She remembered. In that moment, the lie she had built her hatred upon crumbled to dust. Her son hadn't been saved by a miracle. He had been spared. Pike had likely given him a non-lethal dose, just enough to make him sick, to prove his power when the boy, miraculously, recovered. It was a test, a demonstration. Beatrice stared at the reverend, her eyes wide with a horror that was just now dawning. He wasn't a savior. He was the one who had made her son sick in the first place. She staggered back, collapsing into her seat, a hand covering her mouth as a choked sob escaped her lips. The spell was broken. The townspeople looked from Beatrice's horrified face to the reverend's panicked one, and they finally saw the truth. Reverend Pike, trapped and exposed, let out a final, desperate scream of rage. "Heretics! You will all burn for this!" He grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the altar and lunged, not at Thomas or Jedediah, but at Martha. If he was going down, he would take the source of his ruin with him. He never made it. Jedediah moved with a speed that was terrifying. He stepped in front of Martha, a living wall of fur and muscle. He didn't use his rifle. He didn't need to. He caught the reverend's wrist in one massive hand, stopping the blow cold. The candlestick clattered to the floor. With his other hand, Jedediah grabbed the front of Pike's robes. He lifted the sputtering, struggling man clear off the ground, as if he weighed nothing. He held him there for a long moment, their faces inches apart. The wild man of the mountain and the civilized man of God. And in the absolute silence of the church, Jedediah spoke, his voice low and full of a pain that had been buried for years. "This," he growled, "is for Clara." He didn't kill him. He just threw him to the floor at the feet of the townspeople. Pike lay there, a broken, weeping mess. His reign of terror was over. Thomas and Martha Whitlock stood together, their hands clasped. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and they had not faltered. They had faced down a town's hatred and a monster's evil, armed with nothing but their love for each other and the truth. The curse was finally broken. Not by prayer or fire, but by courage. In the days that followed, the full, ugly truth came out. The sheriff confessed. The town council was disgraced. The diary was read aloud, and every family who had lost a child to the winter fever finally understood what had been stolen from them. The town, shamed and humbled, came to the Whitlocks. They offered them their home back. They offered them apologies. They offered them anything they wanted. Thomas and Martha listened patiently, and then they gave their answer. They said no. They couldn't live among the ghosts anymore. Not just the ghosts of their children, but the ghosts of their neighbors' fear and judgment. They packed their few belongings and walked away from the town one last time. But they weren't walking into a merciless wilderness. They were walking up the mountain path, toward a half-burned cabin that they would rebuild, board by board. They were going home. They found a new kind of peace on that mountain, the three of them. A quiet, sturdy peace built on shared sorrow and shared survival. They became their own family, bound not by blood, but by the fire they had walked through together. They never forgot their children. But when they spoke their names now, it wasn't with the bitterness of grief, but with the gentle warmth of memory. They had found justice for them. They had given them the one thing the town never could, the truth. And sometimes, on a clear evening, Martha would look down at the twinkling lights of the town below and remember her mother's words. When the world shuts its doors, you carry your own fire. She finally understood. The fire wasn't just for survival. It was for burning down the lies, for lighting up the darkness, and for showing others the way home. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight, and that true courage is about facing the darkness, even when you're all alone. If you were moved by Martha and Thomas's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because you never know what other secrets are lying buried, just waiting to be uncovered.